Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, we're a law firm that works solely on technology, cybersecurity, and legal issues. In each episode, we look at stories in the law relating to digital technology from around the world, with an emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright. We're just going to run through some of the news stories that will be coming up this week. So I will pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Hi everyone, my name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and we've got some, stories that you may not have heard of, and then one fairly big one that probably you've heard of, but I don't think the actual real digital technology issues of it were properly explained by the government or landed properly. So we'll kick off with that and then go into some more esoteric things. So I'll pass back to Amelia to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So in case you couldn't guess from Peter's explanation there, we are first going to be covering the King's Speech. So as you can imagine, the King's Speech covered a wide variety of topic areas. And as you say, Peter, realistically speaking, the digital technology side didn't really land. I mean, there was a lot in the news about the whole smoking thing, but pretty much not a great deal else.
Yes, so the UK's imported smoking ban, so there's anyone currently below the age of 14 will never legally be able to smoke a cigarette. That's really going to grab the attention, that one. But it did seem to monopolise all, that was the thing most people were talking about. There was actually in the King's Speech, which is the legislative programme for what's left of the term that the British government has, so approximately another year or so, depending on when they decide to call an election. Will they go early in May? Will they go for an autumn election? Or will they eke it out to the last possible moment in January of 2025? You could cut the anticipation with a cricket stump. But the thing here is that actually buried within the 20-odd bills that were announced, there was actually some really good stuff from a digital technology perspective. What I couldn't quite understand is why, having had the AI summit that the government hosted, where Elon Musk and various other private leaders in AI, as well as countries from around the world, including China, all attended Bletchley Park, and the Prime Minister got to talk a lot about AI. There's then some really interesting stuff in this King's Speech about that, but no attempt seemed to be made to actually say, look at all this exciting stuff that relates to what the future will look like. So no attempt, as I say, seemed to be made to communicate that. But there was, I think, it's 4 bits of legislation in particular that I think it's worth looking at.
Certainly. So our first piece here is the autonomous vehicles. So a new automated vehicles bill will pave the way for self-driving vehicles on Britain's roads. So this is essentially kind of the new rules will mean shopping could be delivered without humans, and motorists could become passengers in their own cars. That could be quite fun, couldn't it? Nice long road trip, you just have to sit back and relax.
Yes.
That's a but.
Yeah, so it's a great idea, bless. The issue here is twofold. This is the reason why the UK has been a little bit slower on adopting this technology as a whole. One is the unique way that our cities are laid out, which very often follow medieval street plans that were designed for horses, let alone cars. So whereas, for example, in US cities, you have these well-designed grid systems, big wide open boulevards, which you can kind of program a vehicle to find its way around, and also you're looking at a more constant accelerating and braking and general driving experience. Whereas in the UK, you've got variable acceleration to make it through the lights before they change, and then sudden hard braking to make it round different corners. That presents one challenge when it comes to your urban driving. You've then got the problem that in a more rural setting, our 5G network isn't exactly the strongest, and also coverage as a whole. You've got GPS coverage, but you haven't necessarily got strong enough 5G or even 4G in a lot of regions to be able to say that an autonomous vehicle can have that continuous data connection and be able to get the instructions needed to follow a route, let alone the more sophisticated uploading and downloading of data that will presumably be required for these sorts of vehicles to run, particularly on a long distance. So the minute that you want to, in theory, charge your vehicle for 300 miles and try and drive from one city to another, and you're going to be doing driving that isn't on motorways and is on the more circuitous routes, that could present a problem. That's regardless of all the well-worn tropes around lack of charging network and infrastructure in the UK. It's more, I think, that broadband infrastructure that's a problem. But regardless of these sort of physical problems, the government's saying, well, let's have the framework in place so we can test, we can innovate, we can introduce this stuff. So at least if a autonomous vehicle manufacturer says they want to come to the UK and have their vehicle running with as much autonomy as possible, the legal framework will be there. And in fairness, it's very often actually this regulatory stuff that needs to be properly settled before you can do the exciting things of going out there and building charging stations and making sure networks do what they need to. And this is one of the reasons why it takes so long to get things done in the UK and many Western economies. So it's a good thing that the government is trying to do this, and arguably they should have received some praise on it. I mean, it's not exactly the most exciting thing to run your election campaign on. Vote for us, and you might get automated vehicles within the next 10 years. But it's a step. It's looking at the future. It's not ruminating on the past.
Certainly, and I think one of the interesting points you've not yet touched on, Peter, is the fact that humans will be given immunity from prosecution for if something goes wrong when an autonomous vehicle is in control. I think that's also a very interesting point worth mentioning.
It is, when you've then got the companies facing fines or potential civil or criminal actions for injuries and accidents as a result of the technology. I mean, for anyone who's got that wonderful collision assist, which I have on my vehicle, which in theory has stopped me having many accidents, it's the fact that when it's triggered when you're on an empty road with no one around you, but you think, oh, that's interesting, what's it picked up there? That kind of tells you that the sensors aren't necessarily as 100% foolproof as you might think. So if that sensor was actually in control of the vehicle, a number of times I've just been driving along a normal straight road and I would have probably come to a shuddering stop, which would have probably created more damage as the car behind you sails into the rear of the vehicle. But that's where you're relying on, the sensors and whatever onboard processing thought there was a risk of collision ahead and would have put on the anchors. So, yeah, that's where you could still have, I think, quite significant burden for manufacturers coming along if they then know that, if their autonomous technology then screws up, and you can prove it's screwed up with both data from onboard the vehicle, from onboard cameras, from street side CCTV, of which there's a lot in this country, then you might be facing a problem in terms of the sheer volume of civil liability that might mount up before you get into the fun world of criminal prosecutions.
It's certainly a well thought out, kind of well thought of, but realistically, because you see people think, oh, great, we're not going to be at fault if we're using these vehicles. But at the same time, it's not really encouraging companies with this technology to come to the country, and they're the ones that are going to be fitting the bill.
It will also depend what sort of regimes we then get in other countries. So, if what the UK is putting forward ends up being the standard that you get in most countries, then it'll simply be comparable. If you get some countries rolling it back and say, well, actually, no, we aren't going to make the manufacturers responsible for issues that happen with their autonomous systems, then we're more of an outlier. But in reality, it's difficult to see what other system you could have when technically you're saying to the driver, take your feet off the pedals and your hand off the wheel, and we'll do all of the work for you. How could you really say that's the driver's fault? I mean, if the driver should seize control of the wheel, well, it's going to be their fault, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you've, the guidance at the moment also is that the driver, it's not as though you can ignore the road and get out a drink and have your sandwiches while you're driving. They're still saying you should still sit there ready to take control should the need arise. And that is what all the manufacturers, in particular Tesla, are saying at the moment, so that people don't just sort of ignore what's happening on the road, turn around and have a chat with the passenger.
think it's certainly going to be interesting to see the effect of this bill as we move forward, because I think that then will pave the way for how much this is actually going to be useful and how much it works in terms of
Yeah.
kind of putting it into practice.
And it'll also be interesting to see what scrutiny it gets. Will you have actual members of parliament in the Commons, and particularly the Lords, who will understand a lot of the technical jargon and measures that are being introduced here? Will it actually be meaningful scrutiny? Will it get bogged down? I mean, we looked at what happened to the online safety bill that took 6 years to get through. I mean, it's great that the government's saying, this is our new bill for the legislative programme ahead. But yeah, are you actually going to get that through before it's then this Parliament finishes and everything's up in the air anyway?
Thanks, Peter. So on that happy note, we'll move on to the next point from the King's speech. So this is looking at the media bill. And I know you mentioned the online safety bill there, but the media bill promises a new video on demand code. This will be drafted and enforced by the broadcast regulator, Ofcom. And so this comes about as standards for video streaming services will essentially be hiked, given the fact there are a growing number of children that are consuming content through these video streaming platforms rather than your more traditional television, which I guess is very true. I mean, how many people now prefer to use Netflix or Amazon Prime or Paramount Pictures, etc., for their television needs, rather than your bog standard turn on the big black box in the room and watch whatever's playing.
Yeah, and also let's not forget as well that you've got, as well as the Netflix, Amazon, Paramount, various others, you've also got YouTube.
Yeah.
You've also got TikTok. You've got Meta's Reels on Instagram and Facebook. So you've got a huge amount now of video content potentially being viewed by those from 5 to 15. And it is totally outside of the rules that you'd expect to see on normal broadcast TV. So there's no watershed. We used to be incredibly worried on normal terrestrial TV, what a word, of that anyone might swear before 9 o'clock was seen as being like the end of Western civilization. Whereas now, kids can go online if they've got a device, and they can look at a plethora of material, and there can be a full range of language and images that Ofcom traditionally wouldn't have let anywhere near a broadcast TV network, but is all over certainly those sort of those unregulated platforms, the TikToks and Meta, etc. And even then, a frequent user of Netflix will know that it just comes up and says, "Are you over the age of 15?" before it suggests watching a 15 or an ultra-violent 18 movie, and of course the kid will go, "Yes," and watch whatever it is. So it's hardly the most difficult thing in the world to get round. And arguably, this is the sort of thing that Ofcom should be looking at. Ofcom was always involved in looking at radio and TV communications where there may have been perceived to be problems, and now it's saying we should be extending that remit further. So yeah, arguably a good thing in terms of we should be thinking about this. We have to see what sort of regulation we get on the other side of it. I'm not necessarily saying that regulation of this is a good thing. Indeed, more regulation from governments tends not to be. But this is the sort of thing that Parliament should be talking about and debating and thinking about what policies we want in this field for our mass-produced and mass-consumed media in the future.
Thanks, Peter. So that moves us very nicely onto our next point from the King's speech. So this is the digital markets. So new law aims to protect consumers from being ripped off. And in particular, there'll be a crackdown on so-called dip pricing, which essentially airlines use to push up the cost of tickets by adding extras such as confirmed seating and baggage. I know for a fact that I'm not going to be the only one that's fallen into this trap, because as someone that, we are in a cost of living crisis, and yet I do still want to enjoy a holiday. Booking, with your bog standard airline and then saying, oh great, it cost me another 50 quid to bring luggage and another £5 each way if I want to sit next to the people that I'm going with, etc., etc. So I certainly think this is kind of a great idea, but will it work in principle and in action?
Yes, and this actually relates to the fact there's so much stuff now that we are used to consuming online. I mean, you make the good point there about the cost of living crisis. I think it's been quite instructive for people to think it's not just a matter of, oh, can I afford the weekly shop, or can I afford something from that you would not ordinarily a few decades ago have picked up in a store. People now are doing things like going through their subscriptions. One of the big things that's gone down in the last year was Netflix suddenly announcing that they were losing subscribers rather than growing, because one of the first things that people then cut back on was, well, do I need to be shelling out almost 20 quid on my Netflix subscription? So, because we end up doing it at the end of the day, there's certain sports now that if you want to follow them, you've got to have about 3 or 4 different subscriptions so you can see everything. So we tend to sort of collect these subscriptions. You can even end up collecting there's one coffee shop now where you end up getting a subscription for like endless amounts of coffee. Is it Pret?
Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, you have that sort of idea. And the idea here is that this is a new marketplace, and the Competition and Markets Authority is going to be having its own sort of digital desk, which will be looking at everything from the way that airlines are behaving, or if you're hiring a car, or if you're getting a hotel room, or if you're going to be getting an Airbnb, or any number of the sorts of services that you might be looking to get digitally, where you do get things like surge pricing, and it's the same. It's the same principles we used to have with Uber surging its prices at certain times. So you can rolling out at 2 o'clock in the morning thinking, I'd really like to get home now, and congratulations, we've trebled our prices. It's the same thing that used to happen with the old black cabs anyway, where I'd like to go back in this direction, please, and say, oh no, that's the wrong direction. I'm going this way, so I won't give you a lift. Like, oh, great. And it's just the same thing that you're getting now in the digital sphere, in the digital realm. So again, this is just reflecting, like with that media bill, it's reflecting the way that we are now consuming our products and services. And again, good that this is happening. Good that there will be a debate. Good that there will be a debate around the CMA's powers and how it's going to regulate and enforce this. And it's good that this is being scrutinised in Parliament by the members of both houses. You could argue this should have happened a few years ago, but nothing's perfect, I suppose.
I mean, that very nicely leads us on to our final big tech point from the King's speech here. So everything we've looked at, there is a massive amount of data that's going to need to be collected or stored or processed for the purpose of these. And so now we look at the data protection. So the bill will remove unnecessary barriers to scientific research and allow businesses to protect personal data in a more proportionate way than under the previous EU regime. And essentially, this will also establish a new framework for digital identity checks. So there's a fair amount to unpack here, because what is not mentioned is the fact that we will be coming to the end of the initial adequacy term that was granted. And so that's due to be up in 2024. Therefore, in terms of ensuring we keep the adequacy that we've been given, making changes, we have to be very careful.
We do. And the fact that whenever they keep saying, oh, we're going to have a new data protection bill, I'm going to do this, we're going to do that, no one ever talks about, well, yes, how do you maintain the UK's adequacy status with the European Union? So the problem really is just to make sure that there is plenty of capacity so that adequacy being reviewed can be taken account of, and if possible, you want to maintain that adequacy decision. What does that mean? That means that data of UK citizens can flow to the EU, but more importantly, it's the data of EU citizens flowing to the UK. So that means that the UK can continue to host servers. Its digital tech startups can look to market their products and services within the European Union. They can follow the EU's data protection laws, and I say laws plural because data protection law in Europe varies from state to state, even from Bavaria to Schleswig-Holstein. It's not totally uniform across all EU member states, despite the presence of GDPR. That's the big myth, that everything is totally uniform when it isn't. If anything, the differences are even more difficult to identify and explain, but they are there and must be followed nonetheless. And arguably, this will give the UK a chance to differentiate itself and say, well, we're going to do things differently. And as the the PR blurb says, oh, this will be easier to, people can innovate and it will boost science and research and innovation, which sounds great on paper, but how do you do that while maintaining adequacy, and how much wriggle room have you got? And that will be the one of the big things that the government will have to work out. So reforming of data protection law is not as easy as it may at first sound. If it was easy, we wouldn't still have those cookie banners that come up on all mobile devices in the UK when you look to go online, because in theory, you just wouldn't have to have it. You'd think surely that's an easy win of no longer being in the European Union. But it clearly isn't, because we're now left for a couple of years and they're still all over, even on UK websites designed for UK users. So this is a much more difficult concept and much more difficult prospect to do. And has the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport done its homework with regards to any new bill that is published? We wait to see with bated breath.
Thanks, Peter. So that brings our kind of little section on the King's speech to an end. However, we do still have a few other key stories to talk about today. The first one being Jersey. And so here we are looking at the island's Data Protection Authority and the fact that it has issued I'm not sure it's a fine, but a reprimand for a number of orders for improvement on a company which was essentially spying on one of its employees. So a specific vehicle has been monitored for a month between working hours to get more information on an employee's whereabouts, where they were concerned that this employee was avoiding their duties. And so a member of staff was unaware that they were being tracked and left the company once it was discovered. This is fairly interesting for you to unpack here, Peter.
Yes, and it goes into the world of what lengths an employer can do to keep tracks on an employee. I'd say pre-2020, that would be a matter of, is an employer able to look at an employee's email inbox indefinitely, or could they monitor what they're doing when they're logged in on their desktop PC in the office, or could they monitor how many toilet breaks they're taking, or how many times they go out for a cigarette break, or how many times they go for a coffee? Some employers would sometimes fall foul of arguably having too great a level of surveillance in that regard. There was one employer that actually ended up fitting a device to the monitors on their desktop PCs to work out when the heads of their employees were being pointed downwards, which suggested that they were becoming sleepy from the effects of their exciting job and falling asleep.
Wow.
They didn't go as far as having a sort of electric cattle prod to wake them up, but you felt that the employer, which was a fairly large, well-known employer, would have been quite happy to do that. It really revealed a rather, negative working culture. Obviously, post 2020, it's then a matter of, what if you've got more people are working from home? They are going to be using laptops, phones, tablets. They might be, in this instance, it was a matter of, are they driving around more than they should be for the purposes of their employment? And, it's interesting here, the regulator's saying, well, yes, we agree you had cause. It was the fact that it seems that in effect, while they had the cause to be doing this, covert surveillance was not justified when you compared the right to privacy. Now, I think the first thing to point out here is this happened on Jersey. Jersey is not, for the purposes of our podcast here, part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It is a separate entity. Jersey, Alderney, the Channel Islands, Sark, the Isle of Man, they are all Crown dependencies. So they are dependencies of the British Crown. They are not part of the British state. So they have their own assemblies, elected assemblies, some of which are very ancient in their origins. And they have their own legal systems, some of which are actually based on feudal law. Incredibly, that was the case on Sark, certainly up to about 20 years ago. And then you also have the fact that they have their own data protection authorities. And they have come up with their own regulation and enforcement. In this instance, they're saying that they had sufficient cause, but that wasn't justified when you compare with the employee's right to privacy. In this instance, the employer was just given a formal reprimand and a number of orders for improvement, but they were not fined. But this is going to be under the version of data protection law that was introduced in line with the UK's Data Protection Act 2018 and was in line with the EU's data protection law when these crown dependencies were members of the European Union before the UK left the European Union. And yes, it took the crown dependencies with them. So yeah, that's a little bit of the sort of background there. The interesting thing is, as I say, when you compare this as well to sort of general employee surveillance in England and Wales and in the UK, and in that instance, the general rule is that some surveillance may be carried out, provided you've carried out an impact assessment, and that such surveillance is only carried out for a very specific time-limited period. So, for example, where you have your suspicions that an employee might have their fingers in the till, you would have to carry out an assessment and say, well, okay, we're going to track this person's emails or their internet use or whatever for a very short, specific period for the purposes of establishing whether fraud is being committed or whatever. But then after that period, we will then cease this level of surveillance. So it can't carry on indefinitely. Indeed, I've seen one example of this where the partner at a law firm found out that the managing partner was looking at their emails on a daily basis for months, years at a time, with no real justification. It was just they had the power to do it and they were doing it, and they hadn't carried out any form of impact assessment. They were just freely doing this stuff, and of course the partner was discussing things like health and childcare and various things on what they thought was a private employee email account. So that kind of shows there that you do have safeguards that should still be in place before carrying out this sort of surveillance. I think the takeaway from this case is that where a company is thinking, well, we have concerns with regards to an employee, think very carefully before introducing surveillance. Take a little bit of advice. Think, is it something where you can carry out that impact assessment? If so, how long will you carry out that surveillance for? And think about all these measures very, very carefully before then introducing them. Because in this instance, they decided not to fine that company. But don't forget, in the UK, if there was, say, a complaint to the ICO, and if there were found to be breaches of data protection and privacy, you might be looking at more serious fines, up to £17.5 million, or a couple of percent of global turnover, whichever is greater. So I think it really is a matter of being quite cognizant of the risk rather than carrying out surveillance first and asking questions later.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to a slightly different topic here, we are looking at the UK elections. So this comes after the National Cyber Security Centre, a division of GCHQ, said that the next election will be the first to take place against a backdrop of significant advances in AI. And this is very interesting because I believe we have previously covered about how AI and deepfakes, etc., have been used in the US and potential US elections, but this is the first time it's really being mentioned in depth in the UK.
Indeed, it's the first time it's been flagged up by the UK National Cyber Security Centre. They've said the UK and its allies cannot be complacent to the threat of foreign cyber interference and attempts at influencing our democratic process. And they're quite right to flag that up. This is what the NCSC should be doing. I hope that they are looking at examples, for example, in Slovenia, where they had an election that they think was not necessarily tilted by AI, but certainly during the last few days when you're supposed to have no campaigning, there was then some AI released that purported to show one of the contenders doing something that, of course, they weren't. But, of course, it was AI. And did that mean that the result ended up being effective? Well, you can't tell, really, can you? And it was further clouded by the fact that arguably the government couldn't properly refute it because it was in this sort of mandated period of no campaigning. So you've got that case study. There's also been here in the UK an AI-generated piece of audio was released a couple of months back that purported to be of Sir Keir Starmer making some disparaging remarks, I think, about a particular town or city in the UK. And that, again, is generative AI. In fairness to the government, they turned around and actually said, this is generative AI. It's not true, and they didn't make anything out of it or seek to make any political capital. The point here is that in the cut and thrust of what is likely to be a very divisive and bitter general election in the UK next year, you could get both parties using what they think is a genuine article, and it could in fact be AI, and they won't have carried out the necessary checks in the background. And generative AI has already been used by some of the primary campaigns in the US election. So some of the contenders in the primary campaigns that are taking place have been using generative AI and haven't necessarily flagged up the fact that the images that they're using are generative, and then they're just making various statements about what those images are purported to show. It kind of flags up the fact that we are going to have to be careful next year. What will we necessarily be able to trust some of the things that we see, in particular when it's images and video shared on social media? I think ideally everyone should be very, very wary before they trust anything that they see that's gone viral on X or Meta or TikTok. But of course, that won't happen. Everyone will be highly politicized by all the things that are going back and forth. There will be, I'm sure, posts that go viral that are entirely generative AI, and we'll only see what the real damage is come polling day and thereafter. But this isn't a problem just with, I say, that's unique to the UK. We've got a US and an American election next year, and other elections coming up, and now we have to be cognizant of the risk from generative AI and always asking yourself, can you actually trust the video or image or audio that you are receiving?
Thanks, Peter. So that takes us to our final story of the podcast, and that is Australia. So moving all the way across the world now, and this is looking at one of the major port operators, and they have only just come back online after a cyber attack crippled its facilities. So operations at DP World Australia Container Terminal in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane were disrupted from Friday to Monday morning, and the firm essentially manages around 40% of goods entering and leaving the country. So we're talking about a huge percentage here. This outage has affected the supply of goods to many major Australian supermarkets and has had a massive impact all over, realistically. And our point here is the fact that this is not the first piece of critical infrastructure that has been targeted by cyber attacks.
Yeah.
And it's actually growing increasingly kind of popular with these cyber attacks to target these areas because they do have the most impact.
Yeah. And indeed, we're seeing then that what happens if then sometimes a very well targeted attack, what it can do. We've seen it didn't take much in the UK over the course of the last year to suddenly get empty shelves. When sometimes deliveries were delayed, or there's been rushes on certain items. And in this instance, it wouldn't take much of a delay at some ports for you to then find that suddenly there are problems with deliveries, getting things onto shelves, getting products into shops, getting parts for manufacturing. There is always a massive knock-on effect. You just have to ask yourself how big the effect could be. And I mean, in this instance, you're talking about terminals in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and Perth, which are the main urban centres in Australia, which are therefore going to be very heavily impacted by this sort of thing. And it's the same thing then if you're looking at other key areas of critical national infrastructure, let alone the fact that, of course, it was only about 18 months ago we had that massive delay that was caused by the Suez Canal being blocked by a ship, and then stuff couldn't get through. So imagine that a well-timed cyber attack just disables the opening and closing of locks on the Suez Canal, and that would disrupt global trade between China, from China and India to the west and to Western Africa and the Mediterranean. So it doesn't take a big leap to think of the major impacts that could be had on global commerce from a well-targeted cyber attack. And unfortunately, we are now living in a world where there are actors and nation states out there that might think, oh, we could actually really cause unmitigated havoc here. And it's a darn sight easier to do so and potentially to cause damage to our enemies. It's a lot easier to do it than launching an airstrike. Because by the time everyone's worked out what it is, it's too late.
Exactly, and in this particular instance, they actually do not know who launched a cyber attack as of yet. And I mean, realistically, it might take a few weeks, even months, for them to find out who was responsible for the attack, unless they do come forward, because these investigations do often take a long period of time to really get to the bottom of, well, what caused the attack.
Exactly.
No doubt we will eventually hear more about what caused this, and I'd like to hope we don't talk about more cyber attacks in the future, but
yeah, the thing, of course, is that
fly.
Once again we've ended up leaving the slightly scary story to last. So much for leaving on a positive note. So sorry everyone, but there we are.
So that was our last discussion for this episode. But if you'd like to hear more from us, including subscribing to our newsletter and receiving information about subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to Premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you again to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you'd like to produce your own podcast, webinar, or you'd be interested to hear about Anson Evaluate services, please take a look at their website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. Just a reminder, these episodes are available on our YouTube channel and podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and more. And don't forget, please feel free to leave us a review. And finally, if you have any questions about anything we've talked about today, please feel free to email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.